Thank you, Angela, for framing this correctly. And where you finished is where I would begin. That, and you'll forgive me for saying this, all, bar none, all our policy and legislation, and Madam Joki, you will confirm, treat women as reproductive machines in this country. That's where we begin. So we can talk as much as we want here, but the laws of this country that have anything to do with women, the constitutional provisions that mention women explicitly, they deal with them as reproductive machines. And once you stop being reproductive, you are erased from our social setup. So that is something that we might have to think about going forward. And this emanates from our social and cultural environments, which cannot conceive of women as anything other than reproductive machines. And so you have to start confronting those cultural underpinnings of our behavior, the religious background of our thinking, and how we have set up our governance system. Because everything is about the fact that we argue about whether how women should have sex, when they should have sex, with whom they should have sex, what happens after sex, what happens to the products of sex. We legislate all that. We've put it in the Constitution, Madam Joki. And that's where the problem starts. And then I will pivot from society to the brain, and I will tell you that the human brain bathes in a soup of chemicals. That is what the human brain bathes in. And this soup of chemicals that our unique brains bathe in is dependent on the function of other body organs. And there are body organs that are far away from the brain, including the reproductive organs, the ovaries, the testicles, which produce chemicals that make their way to the brain, and they become part of what bathes our brain. And our brain is made up of nerves that communicate through electrical signals, which are influenced by the soup in which the brain is sitting. And so how we behave is influenced by the composition of that soup in which your brain is bathing. And therefore, when that environment, that chemical environment changes, the things that we call hormones, when the ratios of those hormones changes, their interaction with our brain influences how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. That is a biological foundation of behavior. And menopause is perhaps one of the best examples how our mental health is affected by our physical state. Because a lot of the feelings, thoughts, behaviors that women going through menopause, which is really a product of hormonal change at a certain stage of life, how they feel and behave is influenced by that change in the soup in which the brain is bathing. And therefore, inevitably, there are consequences. Some of these consequences are tolerable, so people can live with them, and some of them are disabling and impairing. When do these changes occur? When I was asked to speak a little bit about what are the common mental health issues or impacts around menopause. And I asked myself, when do those changes in the soup that bathes the woman's brain, when do those changes occur? So again, looking from inside out, they occur at a time of great change in the life of a woman, which induce multiple anxieties, some of which are not necessarily related to the change that is happening in the brain. Menopause occurs at a time when, for many people who have families and children, when the children are becoming or have become adults and are leaving the home and have their own lives to take care of, and they have their own children. And your role as a parent has to change. And how you interact with your offspring and their offspring has to change. But change is difficult because you have been used to doing things a certain way. Menopause also occurs at a time when many people who are fortunate to have older relatives or parents are taking care of parents who are much older and experiencing the vagaries of life. These bodies tend to become frail as we age. They get chronic diseases, they get disabilities. And menopause is happening to you when you're taking care of older relatives who are going through those changes themselves. So that is another reason why it's an interesting part of a person's life. Menopause also occurs at a time when many people are sitting back and taking stock of what they have made of this life and what this life has meant, because you've done so many things, and what impact have you had in this life. And for some people, interrogating what they have done with life can produce certain anxieties, because then you start worrying about the things you haven't been able to do that you thought you ought to be able to have done at that point in your life. As has been mentioned severally, menopause also occurs at a time of social changes, even in relationships. So whatever relationships you're having, whether it's with a spouse or with relatives or with friends or other family members, there are changes that are happening socially around that time anyway, menopause or no menopause. And that is the time that you're also experiencing menopause, and these changes are happening. And so when one is thinking about a person going into menopause, person experiencing menopause and post-menopause, you cannot think about that period in isolation. You cannot think about it only as what is happening inside a person, but you have to think about this person, the environment, holistically, as a part of a greater whole. And therefore, some of the features, some of the symptoms that emerge during menopause not only affect the individual who's experiencing them, but they also affect their social environment. So issues like lethargy, which is common during menopause, because the hormones that are produced before menopause, they help you to harness energy, to focus your energies, to do the things that you think are important to you, and so on. When there's fluctuations in those hormones, then there's lethargy and difficulty doing the things that you would normally be able to do. There is cognitive slowing, what we are hearing people call brain fog. A difficulty in following through with plans, memory impairment, and so on and so forth, which also have to do with those changes that have happened in the hormonal environment in which your brain is functioning. There will be sleep changes, because again, those hormones interact with other chemicals that regulate when you sleep, how much you sleep, and how much rested you feel after you sleep. There is the heightened senses. I see the women here smiling. The heightened senses. So, this might be a normal, nice, lovely touch when you're 25, 30. But then it's like a blow when you're at a certain age. So there's that heightened sensation, both of touch, heat, all sorts of sensation, even sound, and so on and so forth. So those are because the brain was bathing in a different environment as you are thriving and growing, and now it is bathing in a totally different environment, and it is having to deal with it. Remember, the brain is blind. The brain lives inside a dark chamber inside your skull, and it only knows what's happening out there through those senses. And so when it is getting hyperstimulated, it goes into spaces where you protect yourself because the environment out there is harsh, and it doesn't know any better. There's emotional lability. I mean, this means your emotions, sometimes you don't feel like you are fully in control of them. All right? So sometimes you want to be happy, but then you're not happy, yeah? my son has graduated from campus and I'm supposed to be there cheering and so on, but I'm not feeling cheerful. And I don't know why I'm not feeling cheerful, because I should. Everything says I should, but I'm not. And it changes like that, and that's a common feature of menopause. So when you have all these features that I have listed, accompanied by the physical changes of menopause, then those are quote unquote normal psychological occurrences during menopause. But then we have things that become less adaptive. So sometimes we diagnose depression during menopause. And this is a person who has the features of depression, they meet the full clinical criteria of depression, and the symptoms have emerged during menopause. And the same with anxiety and increased risk of suicide in this population. Okay? So often what the research says is that this, what we might call pathological findings in menopause, when I see them in a woman going through menopause, I take a history, and often you will discover that a person who is being diagnosed for the first time with depression during menopause, a significant proportion of them have had depressive symptoms even before menopause. And therefore, menopause might be exacerbating or triggering episodes of depression. It might not necessarily be the cause of depression. And the same with anxiety, and the same with the risk of suicide. So I think this is framing the common psychological and mental problems that one might expect to experience as they go into menopause. And to say, so for the ones that I mentioned about lethargy and so on and so forth, there is treatment, as my colleagues have talked about: hormone replacement and social and environmental changes and diet and so on and so forth, and exercise and so on and so forth. But then when we diagnose clinical depression, anxiety, suicidality, then there are mental health treatments as well for those that would go in tandem with management of menopause. I do know that I have probably very little time remaining, but I think there's a part of this that has to do with integrating mental health in the care for menopause. And speaking as a mental health advocate, I think I do not narrow it, and I was having a conversation with a colleague, and I said mental health must be integrated in all aspects of health and in all aspects of life, because it begins with promotion, which has to do with eating healthy, physical activity, social connection, mindfulness. This is promoting good mental health, whether you are in menopause or before. We talk about prevention. This is early identification of problems, having access to counseling services, creating a social network, taking care of those, the pombe, cutting down on that, substances and so on and so forth. And then talking about issues, having a forum to talk about it like this. It goes into treatment, which is identifying those problems and providing treatments. And treatment is not only medication, but it can be social interventions, changing your environment. It can be psychological treatment, and it can also be medications. And finally, speaking about stigma. I think for stigma, we have to talk about addressing ignorance, and my colleagues here have talked about increasing access to information about mental health and about menopause as well. They've talked about addressing prejudices, that is changing our attitudes towards mental health, both towards mental health itself and to those who are suffering with mental ill health. And we've talked about discrimination, addressing discrimination through social norms, taboos, but also through legislation and through policy. The final thing I would say for menopause care, from my experience in mental health, I would say this is not an individual's problem. So when you're addressing the problems of menopause, please include families in these conversations. Please include the social network of this individual in those conversations so that they become part of the social support network that helps the woman to deal with the challenges that they face during menopause. Thank you very much.